Think about everything you learned in school about history, the pyramids, ancient Greece, the Roman Empire, maybe a little bit about China or India or the Maya if your teacher was feeling ambitious. Then you jump to the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, the World Wars, the Internet. Your phone glowing right now in your hand. It feels big, right? Dense. Like you already tried to cram way too many names and dates into a brain that just wanted sleep. But here's the thing. Everything you normally call history, every empire, every holy book, every war and treaty and constitution and revolution, all of that fits into a strip of time that's only about the last 5,000 years. 5,000. Now put that next to this modern humans, people with bodies and brains like yours have been around for over 300,000 years. Let that number sit with you for a second. You get 300 years of us, and only about 5,000 of those have written records. Do the math. That means roughly 98% of the human story has no pages, no documents, no diaries, no laws carved into stone, no official anything. 98%. If your entire life was a 24-hour day, all the stuff in your history textbooks, the whole thing would be like the last couple of minutes before midnight. All the rest, the previous 23 hours and 58 minutes, blank pages, no written records, no cities, no kingdoms, no palaces or capitol buildings raising flags over anything. Just this vast, silent stretch of time where people were absolutely living and thinking and feeling, and we almost never hear their voices. You can feel how wrong that is, can't you? Because your brain has been trained to think that history is mostly about governments and writing and big stone monuments. If nothing is written down, if there are no kings, no skyscrapers, no neon signs, then the story feels like it doesn't even count. But your body didn't get that memo. Your body, your nervous system, your instincts, they were all shaped across those missing years. That 98%, the part no one told you about. So here you are, scrolling in the dark, and underneath your thoughts about deadlines and messages and notifications, there's this deeper program running, a very old one that doesn't come from Rome or Egypt or any of the civilizations that got a chapter in your schoolbook. It comes from a time you weren't ever really taught to imagine. Start here. When we say modern humans, we're not talking about people who just sort of looked vaguely like us. We're talking about anatomically modern humans. Same basic skeleton, same skull shape, same kind of face, and most important, the same size and structure of brain. Someone living 300,000 years ago, from the neck up, could walk past you on the street dressed like you, maybe with headphones in, and you probably wouldn't notice anything odd. Their brain was a primitive version. It was a half-minus finished bait, a build waiting for an update. As far as we can tell, it was basically the same hardware you're using right now to read this. That's the part that scrambles your sense of time. Because if people with brains just like yours have been around for over 300 years, what were they doing all that time? What did they think about? What did they fear? What did they love? What did they tell their children when the night was too quiet and too dark? And here's where the mystery gets even deeper. When you look at the physical traces, the things that survive in the ground, the bits and pieces people dig up and try to understand, there's this long stretch where you don't see clear signs of what we'd call modern symbolic behavior. That phrase sounds technical, but the idea is simple. Symbolic behavior is everything your brain does when it treats one thing as standing for another thing. A sound that stands for an idea. A mark on a surface that stands for a word. A carved shape that stands for an animal, or a god, or a story. A pattern of colors on your skin that says, I belong to this group, not that one. It's means. It's language. It's art. It's ritual. It's the entire invisible universe of meaning your mind swims in all day without even noticing. You live inside symbols. You're surrounded by them. The logos on your clothes, the numbers in your bank app, the notifications on your screen, the letters forming this sentence. But when you look far enough back into that huge sweep of time, into that 98%, the physical evidence of this kind of behavior is strangely thin. For a very long time, the record looks quiet. You don't see long text carved into durable material. You don't see giant organized cities laid out with obvious planning. You don't see obvious, large scale monuments screaming, "We believed this. We worshipped that. We organized our lives this way." On paper, if you can even use that word here, it looks like hundreds of thousands of years of almost nothing. That can't be right, you think. Same brain, same hardware, and yet for an immense stretch of time, the visible traces of the software you'd expect, the art, the stories, the complex symbols just don't show up clearly. It's like walking into a library that's supposed to hold 300,000 years of human experience and finding almost all the shelves empty, a few scattered volumes at the very end. That's it. Look at your room, your bed, your phone. Each object you can see has layers of meaning attached to it. The shape of your plug, the letters on your charger, the brand on your pillow, even the color you chose for your case. Now imagine a world where, for hundreds of thousands of years, people with your same kind of brain move through their days, but we hardly find anything that survives to show how they encoded meaning into the world. We don't have their playlist. We don't have their notebooks. We don't have their symbols etched into something that lasted. Just absence. Just a rumor of minds. That's the first part of the mystery. You've got this enormous timeline, 300,000 years of anatomically modern humans. The bodies, the brains, those are there. They are us. But when you ask, okay, so where's their equivalent of paintings, or songs, or complex stories? The physical record goes mostly quiet for this enormous span. You can feel how wrong, but is on a gut level, because you know your own mind. Leave you alone for an afternoon with nothing to do and your brain starts making things. You daydream. You hum songs. You imagine conversations. You replay old memories and edit them a little bit each time. You generate symbols like your lungs generate breath. So it's hard to picture someone with your same neural wiring not doing that. Now stretch the person's life out across colliding generations. One person, then their children, then their grandchildren. Thousands of families, tens of thousands, millions, each with brains capable of memory, language, imagination, dreams. Now stack that up not just over a century, not over a millennium, over hundreds of thousands of years. And then picture yourself in front of that library of time, pulling open drawer after drawer after drawer, and most of them are empty. If this were a detective story, this is the moment where you'd realize the crime is bigger than you thought. Because this isn't a minor gap. It isn't a missing month in someone's calendar, or a decade where nobody kept their receipts. It's almost the entire human story. The part where the main character grows up. No written records, no cities, no kingdoms, almost nothing that you, a child of the last few seconds before midnight, would recognize as civilization. And yet there were people. They woke up, they slept, they got hurt, they healed, they held each other when someone died. They watched the sky and tried to make sense of it. You feel them like a pressure behind a wall you can't see through. Think about how much drama fits into a single human life. Think about the fights, the reconciliations, the tiny betrayals, the huge joys, the quiet afternoons that you think you'll forget, but that stay with you anyway. Now multiply that by every human who has ever lived. The total number is staggering. But even if you don't know the exact figure, you can sense the weight of it. Billions of lifetimes stacked on top of each other, generation after generation, after generation after generation. Most of those people lived in that 98% of unrecorded time. Not in the last few thousand years where we start keeping track of names and dates and laws. They lived in the deep silence, the part the textbooks more or less skip. A chapter heading prehistory. A couple paragraphs. Maybe a timeline with some arrows. Then, boom, Egypt. From your point of view, that missing era is the prologue you flipped past to get to the real story. From time's point of view, the missing era is the story. Everything else is the epilogue. We're barely starting. There's another layer to this that's easy to miss. When you hear no written records, no cities, no kingdoms, there's a reflex that kicks in. You imagine those missing years as simpler, duller, empty of complexity. Like a lobby where everyone is just waiting for the real movie civilization to start. But complexity doesn't need skyscrapers. Your own emotional life can be painfully complex on a day when literally nothing visible happens. You stay in your room. You barely move from the outside. That day is a still picture. On the inside, it can be a storm. So imagine 300,000 years of inner weather, of people with your same mental machinery watching the world and having opinions about it. Getting bored, getting curious, getting angry, getting infatuated. The question isn't were their lives eventful. The question is how did they carry all that meaning without the visible infrastructure we now assume has to be there. If you zoom out, there's a pattern that makes this feel even stranger. In that thin little slice we call recorded history, once writing and cities and kingdoms show up, things start changing very fast. You see inventions build on other inventions. You see ideas spread and mutate. You see feedback loops, new tools, changing how people think, which changes what they build next, which changes how they live. 5,000 years feels crowded, but the hardware that's driving all this, the brain, has been around for so much longer. That's like discovering that your phone has had the same processor for 60 years, but only in the last minute did anyone install apps. And suddenly you're stuck with two options, neither one quite comfortable. Either these people with brains like ours spent hundreds of thousands of years mostly not using the full symbolic potential we take for granted now, or they did use it. They lived inside stories and symbols and invisible structures, just as complex as ours, but those structures were expressed in ways that leave almost no durable trace that we can find. In one version, human minds were somehow dormant. In the other, they were fully awake, but speaking in media that the ground doesn't remember. Both possibilities are wild. And maybe the truth lies somewhere in between, in a gradient we can't see clearly. But from where you're sitting tonight, in the narrow band of time we can document, the big and settling fact remains. For something like 98% of the time that people like you have been walking the earth, the record they left behind is almost silent by your standards. No library catalogs, no official chronicles, no neat sequences of rulers and treaties, just a vast, dim hallway of time, lined with doors that mostly don't open. Pause for a second and notice how your mind is trying to cope with that. It reaches for images it knows. It wants to fill the gap with something. So it pulls from movies, from illustrations in books, from half-minus remembered diagrams of cavemen huddled in front of fire. But those images are tiny, thin, cartoonish. They're built to be a background, not a full world. The reality, whatever it really looked like, would have been enormous and variable. Hundreds of thousands of years is enough time for fashions to rise and fall, for habits to change and change again. Enough time for entire ways of thinking to bloom and then vand, and anything solid behind. Yet your mental picture of that age is probably stuck on one loop. People in furs, rough tools, A kind of permanent, unchanging gray. Your brain hates blank spaces, so it fills them in with stereotypes. But the numbers don't lie. 300,000 years of modern humans. 5,000 with writing. 90-8% with no written records. No cities, no kingdoms. That's a hole you can fall into. Now, shift the camera. Instead of thinking about all of humanity, imagine just one person living, say, 200,000 years ago, anatomically modern, same kind of brain. You don't know their name. No one does. They didn't leave a signature that lasted. But for a moment, bring them into focus. Picture yourself waking up as them. You open your eyes. Your muscles ache from the day before. Your brain starts its checklist. Hunger, safety, familiar sounds, the presence or absence someone you care about beside you. Your thoughts are not simple. They're layered. You remember what someone said to you yesterday and how it made you feel. You think about where you might go today. You carry long minus-term worries and tiny superstitions, things you do just in case. Because the world feels big and unpredictable, you daydream. Maybe about being somewhere else. Maybe about not being frightened anymore. Maybe just about food. All of that interior activity is so normal to you that you forget how invisible it is. You can talk. You can plan. You can cheat and joke and pretend. You can imagine what someone else is thinking and adjust your behavior around that. From the inside, your life feels crowded with meaning. Now pull the camera way back and look down on that same person from far above, as if you were watching from some cold, timeless vantage point. Where actually survives. Not their breath, not their thoughts, not their fears, not the stories they told sitting in the dark. What survives are the things you can drop, lose, bury, burn, abandon, and that also happen to be made of materials tough enough to endure hundreds of thousands of years. Most of what fills a human life never meets those conditions. Your favorite song doesn't survive if all copies vanish. Your most important conversation dies with the last person who remembers it. Your private rituals end when you stop doing them. Scale that up. If the minds in that deep past were as active as yours and their brains suggest they were capable, then there's this invisible universe of vanished meaning that never had a chance against time. The archaeological record, the stuff that gets dug out of the ground, is like the charred scraps left after a library fire. You infer the whole from the leftovers. But in those deep, deep layers of time, the leftovers are very, very few. So when you hear the archaeological record shows a long period without clear evidence of modern symbolic behavior, it doesn't necessarily mean nothing symbolic was happening. It means the traces we can see, touch, date, point to, are thin. They don't scream. Here is a culture obsessed with symbols the way we are. They don't hand us obvious, enduring, interpretable signs that people were weaving advanced layers of meaning into objects. From your point of view, trained on manuscripts and monuments, it looks like a void. From their point of view, there might never have been a void at all. That tension between what probably happened in living minds and what we can actually see in the ground is the heart of the mystery. You know two things at once. First, anatomically modern humans have existed for over 300,000 years. That's not a guess about some other kind of human. That's us, our branch. Second, for a very long stretch of that time, you don't see clear, durable, physical evidence that they were using symbols in the sustained, obvious ways that define your everyday world. And wrapped around those two facts is a third, the tiny sliver of time that you do have written records for about 5,000 years covers only a couple of % of that total span. So history, as you've been taught it, floats on this ocean of unrecorded human time. It's like reading the last page of a novel and assuming you know the whole plot. Your instincts about what humans are like, what's natural for our species, what counts as normal life, All of that is based on the modern environment and the thin slice of recorded time behind it. But the template your brain and body were shaped around, that sits in the missing part. The dark water under the little raft of history. You feel that mismatch every time the modern world claws at you in ways, you constant notifications that exhaust you. The sense that you're supposed to be on all the time. The way your nervous system reacts to certain kinds of social stress, as if it's literally life or death. Those reactions weren't built in the last few thousand years. They come from older code. They come from the missing 98%, and we hardly know the details of that world. We have almost no direct record of the rituals that code grew out of, the daily rhythms, the patterns of attention, the kinds of stories that felt necessary. We live inside a body tuned for a story we forgot how to tell. Maybe you feel a bit of anger under the eye. Because think about it, you were given a map of human history that basically says, nothing really happens until writing on cities and kingdoms show up. But that erases almost everything. It suggests that the only human lives that count, that matter, that are worth remembering in detail, are the ones that by sheer chance happen to fall in the little 2% of time where someone was scratching marks onto something that didn't rush away. Everyone before that, a vague mass, a backdrop, the Stone Age, before, as if 300,000 years of people like you were just a long tutorial level for the real game of recorded civilization. Yet when you bring the numbers back into view, 300,000 versus 5,000, you can see the imbalance. It would be like watching the credits of a movie where 98% of the cast are unlisted, unnamed, with no roles assigned, just extras. But none of them were extras in their own lives. The gap between what existed and what we can see is what makes this feel almost supernatural. Because imagine if you could actually drop in on a random year, pick any moment out of those hundreds of thousands and watch, invisible, as people went about their lives. Would it feel alien? Or would it feel uncomfortably familiar? Would you see parents arguing about how to handle a child who won't listen? Would you see someone sitting apart, staring at nothing, lost in a private storm of thought? Would you see two people flirting in that awkward, half-minus joking way that says, interested, but I need you to laugh. Oh, I can pretend I didn't mean it if you reject me. With the same brain structures, the same emotional circuits, the same social wiring, how different could the inner experience be? But the outer framework, no written records, no cities, no kingdoms, tells you that whatever those experiences looked like on the surface, they weren't embedded in the kinds of systems you now assume are universal. No official calendars on walls, no printed money, no borderlines on maps, just people and time and memory. And memory, and like writing, is fragile. Your whole sense of who you are can be shaken by forgetting a handful of key moments. An entire community's sense of itself can change if a few elders die before they pass certain stories on. Now stretch that fragility over 98% of the human storyline. With nothing but living minds to carry it, you start to feel the vertigo of how much meaning has slipped through the cracks. Stand in your living space for a moment in your head, if not actually standing, and imagine that everything not made of something incredibly durable is destined to vanish without a trace. All your digital files dissolve as if they never existed. Paper turns to mush and disappears. Plastic fabrics were gone eventually. What's left? Maybe a few pieces of metal, maybe some glass, if it doesn't shatter and scatter past recognition. A handful of things at most. Now imagine a future intelligence trying to reconstruct your entire culture from those leftovers. What did they care about? What did they worship? What did they fear? What did they find beautiful? They did have to guess. They did know that people like you had the brain power to write novels, code software, build entire symbolic universes, but their sample would be tiny and biased. They might conclude that you never really used your full potential, that you were smart enough, but strangely quiet. That's more or less the position we're in when we look back at the deep human past. We know the hardware was there early. We know that from a certain point on, humans can and do explode with symbolic activity, writing, art, complex stories. But when we peer back into that much longer stretch behind it, the clear physical signs of that symbolic hurricane just aren't obvious. The archaeological record looks, by our modern standards, reserved, minimalistic. So we sit here at this end of time, with three puzzle pieces in our hand. First, modern humans anatomically like us have existed for over 300,000 years. 2. Recorded history, in the sense of written documents, covers only about the last 5,000. 3. For a very long slice of that earlier time, the physical evidence doesn't clearly show the kind of symbol-saturated behavior that's baked into every second of your current life. Everything else is inference and imagination, which leads to the question that hovers over all of this. What were we doing? Not in some broad, generic way surviving or evolving or developing, but in the particular, gritty details that actually make up a life. What did an in-minus joke sound like 100,000 years ago? What did a lullaby sound like? What did fear of the dark do to someone's chest? What kinds of invisible agreements held people together? The unspoken rules, the expectations, the lines you didn't cross. We don't have those scripts. We just have the knowledge that there were actors on a stage that lasted far longer than the one we're used to looking at. You're used to the idea that you were born into a world with instruction manuals, lock oaths, religious constitutions, advertising slogans, large, externalized, durable carriers of what we believe and how we live. But for the majority of our existence, as far as we can tell, there weren't no instruction manuals you could shelve anywhere but inside a human skull. No external storage. That's a different way to be human. And we barely know how it felt. So when you lie there scrolling at night, overwhelmed by the noise of your tiny, late slice of history, there's an older silence under it. An immense, collective experience that mostly evaporated because it never got off the hard drive of the human brain and onto anything that time could respect. We've built a self, minus image, onto percent of our story. The other 98% is what? Practice? Preparation? An era of minds quietly learning to be human without leaving much behind. Or was that the peak? And this frantic recorded moment is the strange afterglow. We can't say. Not yet. Maybe not ever. We just know this: there is a stretch of time, more than 50 times longer than the entire span of recorded history, during which people with brains like ours lived and died on this planet, and from our vantage point, their voices are almost completely gone. Almost, because a few traces did make it off the volatile memory of living minds and onto something the planet was willing to keep. Stone, bone, pigment baked into rock, not the voices themselves, but the fingerprints of thinking. So if you want to feel that missing 98%, become a little less abstract, you start with bones in the ground. In one place that is now called Morocco, a group of skulls and jaws turned up in rock layers older than anyone expected for our kind. Fossils whose shape said, "This is you," even though the rock said, "This is 300,000 years ago." Same basic cranial volume, same kind of face, same brain, in all the ways that matter for thought. You're supposed to imagine a huge gulf between primitive and modern, but that boundary blurs here. Someone who could walk past you on the street, genetically speaking, lived in a world with no metal, no cities, no written names. The hardware was already online. That's the unsettling part. Because if the brain was already capable of poetry and mathematics and myth, the landscape isn't full of obvious signs of those things. What does that mean? It could mean we're missing almost everything. Think about what actually preserves. If you paint your body with color, then wash it off. The color is gone. If you tie a ritual object from bark or leather and leave it in the rain wins. If you sing every night and never carve the song into anything solid, the browser window closes when you die. And yet, some very fragile seeming behaviors did leave faint echoes. In sediments far older than most people realize, there are lumps of red ochre iron rich earth that didn't just happen to be there. They were scraped, ground, processed. Someone went out of their way to make powder, to make color. Maybe they rubbed it on skin. Maybe they marked stone. Maybe they colored the dead. Whatever the exact use, it was food, it was shelter, it was a spear stip. It was meaning. It was more than survival. Later, you get tiny shells with holes pierced through them, far from any shoreline this particular species would have lived in. Beads, carried, collected, strung together, probably around necks or wrists or ankles, clacking softly when someone moved. Identity, externalized. I'm part of this group. I have crossed that threshold. I belong to this story. There are burials where bodies were placed carefully, not just dumped, sometimes with red pigment, sometimes with objects that had no practical purpose in a grave, things that seemed like offerings, or companions, or symbols trying to say, this person matters beyond their last breath. Taken together, these scraps whisper that symbolic thought was not a switch that suddenly flipped right before recorded history. It seeped in. It changed shape over long spans of time. But the picture is jagged. For huge intervals, the ground goes quiet. Or at least, quiet in the ways we know how to read. This is where people start arguing. One camp says something radical happened late. A cognitive revolution. New software for an old machine. Maybe language clicked into a new gear. Maybe the way we handle stories or imagine things that aren't physically present suddenly scaled up. And when that software patch, installed sometime around 70 to 60,000 years ago, everything accelerated. The tools diversified and specialized. The art exploded. The long distance networks of exchange became clear in the material record. Another camp says no, you're underestimating how biased your evidence is. You're judging subtle, fragile behaviors by what can survive in dirt for tens of thousands of years. You're mistaking absence of proof for proof of absence. Maybe the so-called revolution was just the moment when conditions and materials happen to line up so we get a crisp snapshot. Before that, the movie was playing, we just don't have the footage. Both possibilities are humbling. Either our minds did a late, wild upgrade, or they've been capable of this the whole time and we just lost the logs. And through all of this, something else is easy to forget for most of that long period. We weren't alone. Other humans, not metaphors, not monsters, actual humans of different kinds walked the same earth. Some had stuck, our bones and different skull shapes. But their brains were big, their lives were complex. They made tools. They adapted to harsh climates. They probably told their own stories about us if they ever met us. You share ancestry with some of them, tiny fragments of their DNA live quietly in your cells, which already tells you they weren't some utterly separate category. They could fall in love with us, have children, blend. The fact that you are here and they are not raises another question we can't quite settle. We outcomputed them because our social software was just that much better, more flexible language, richer networks, the ability to coordinate larger groups. Or did shifts in climate and pure luck play the real starring roles, with our species just happening to be in the right pockets of habitat when things got rough? If you want an easy myth, you say, we were simply superior. If you want an honest answer, you say we don't know. The dice of deep time rolled, and this is the configuration that survived. By the time that supposed cognitive surge hits its stride, the archaeological record starts looking like someone turned the saturation up. In caves that would one day be called Shoved or Lascaux, walls became canvases. Picture yourself stepping into one of those places. At the moment of creation, torch in hand, smoke curling against stone. Someone moves up close, their hands steady, using the uneven surface of the rock to give a painted animal the illusion of muscle, of motion. There's shading, there's perspective, there's style. This isn't someone doodling abstinently. It's practiced, intentional, a performance stretched across stone and time. Now realize when those paintings went up, there is still no farming in the world, no cities, no kings, no written alphabets, just small bands of people whose entire material culture could be carried when the group moved, and yet they dedicated time and energy to this, to art that almost no one would see, to images that took hours in the dim light. Somewhere not far from such caves, someone is hollowing out bone to make a flute, carefully, because if the holes are wrong, the sound is wrong. A scale, a pattern of notes, is being tested by breath in a world where nothing like a music industry exists. You don't do that unless the invisible things, stories, songs, shared feelings have become central to what it means to be part of a group. Tools are changing too. Instead of just a few generalized shapes, you start to see a variety of specialized implements, things crafted for particular tasks. The equivalent of moving from a single multi-minus tool to an entire workshop of options. All of this points to minds that are not just reacting but planning, imagining, iterating, and still no instruction manuals outside of minds. Step back from the caves, away from the spectacular exceptions, and imagine the day minus to minus day life of the people whose hands held those pigments and flutes. Small groups, moving with the seasons, tuning their movements to migrations, ripening cycles, water sources, winds. They didn't have maps with contralines, but they had something more intimate, a lived, embodied map, laid into memory from childhood. Every bend of a river tied to a plant, an animal, a story about what happened there last time. You think of hunter-gatherer life as precarious, but when anthropologists describe societies that still lived this way until very recently, a different pattern appears: ecological knowledge, flexible social structures, and, in many cases, relatively little time spent on the actual work of getting food compared to how many hours you pour into jobs and commutes now. The phrase some researchers use is the original affluent society. Not because people had a lot of stuff they didn't, but because, more often than you'd guess, they had enough. And they had time. Time to talk, time to dance, time to argue and make up and teach and sit quietly staring at a fire you didn't have to buy. Those are the kinds of hours your nervous system grew up in. Evolutionary. Not centuries, not millennia, hundreds of thousands of years. When you feel a strange, nameless exhaustion, from notifications and schedules and economic weather reports, part of what you're feeling might just be a stone-age brain being asked to run a modern operating system at a clock speed it never had to handle before. Go even colder in your imagination. Ice Age. Not a cartoon of people in shaggy furs, but actual wind that cuts through to the bone, temperatures that can kill you overnight, landscapes where a wrong move means you simply don't live long enough to tell the story. In that world, just surviving demands innovation, tailored clothing, not just draped hides, shelters built from the bones of huge animals, group hunts where everyone has a role, and if one person fails, everyone feels it. Climate docents, it's still in this period. Either it lurches, warms, cools, forces people to adjust, move, learn places they thought they understood. Again, no cities, no fixed borders, but high technology for the context, woven from stone, wood, bone, sinew, and knowledge. And while all of this is happening, our species is not staying in one place. Sometime around 60,000 years ago, groups of modern humans begin pushing out from their African homelands in a movement that, over generations, redraws the human map. Through coasts and rivers and mountain passes, through forests and plains they go. To reach lands now called Australia, they have to cross water deep enough that you can't just wade. That implies boats or rafts, navigation decisions, a willingness to step onto something that floats and aim for land you cannot see. They'll reach the Americas, eventually, distant islands in vast oceans. Each step isn't a heroic one-time voyage in your sense, it's incremental, generational, but it adds up to something staggering within a relatively short slice of that long prehistory. Humans of your type learn to live in everything from tropical coast to frozen tundra, from dense forests to high plateaus, different plants, different animals, different dangers, same brain. Somewhere along the way, you start to see more elaborate traces of what we would now call spiritual life. Bodies arranged with care, graves featuring pigments, tools, perhaps food. Places that may have served as ritual centers, not necessarily permanent towns, but locations groups return to, where big shared performances of belief and identity happened. Jump forward in your mind's timeline to just over 11,000 years ago, and on a hill that will later be called Göbekli Tepe, hunter-gatherers do something wild. Without domesticated crops, without villages of baked brick, without kings or palaces, they move huge stones. They carve them. They set them in circles. They move huge stones. They carve them. They set them in circles. You stand there in your mind on that hill, 11,500 years before your time, and you feel something very specific. This is not just about shelter. This is not about storage. This is about meaning. The stones are taller than a person, heavy enough that even with a whole group pushing, dragging, levering with wooden poles, it's exhausting work. Days, maybe seasons. The surfaces are smoothed. Shapes of animals appear, things with teeth and claws and horns, things you hunt, things that can kill you. The stones face inward into a kind of shared empty space that is not really empty, because it's where stories live. And you have to remember, these are still hunter-gatherers. They don't have fields. They don't have barns packed with grain. They don't have kings ordering them around. They have moving camps, seasonal routes, knowledge of plants and animals written into memory instead of into books. And yet, they coordinate massive construction projects that will still be sitting here when your whole civilization comes along and says, wait, what? So already, one thing becomes hard to deny: every old humans, just like you, were capable of organizing, planning, and believing together on a scale you were told only starts with civilization. Göbekli Tepe is like a beacon near the end of prehistory, a late, monumental flare in the night sky. But it's not the beginning of the story of human meaning. To understand how you get from anonymous bands of foragers to stone circles on a hill, you have to rewind, far beyond that, back into deep time, back to where the trail gets framed, back to where the evidence is mostly bones and stains in the dirt and fragments of things that were once whole. Start that rewind in Africa, not in a neat dot of Eden dot on the map, not in a single magical valley, but across an entire continent. The latest fossils that reshaped the story don't come from the places the older textbooks love to point to. They come from a rocky site in what is now called Morocco, on Africa's northwestern shoulder, Jebel Irhoud. For a long time, people thought your species, Homo sapiens, was maybe 200,000 years old. Then the Jebel Irhoud fossils were dated, roughly 315,000 years old. Just sit with that number for a second. 315,000 years. You, lying there scrolling a device, live in year 2000-something of a calendar you've inherited. These people at Jebel Irhoud are more than 300,000 years older than that calendar, and yet their bones, especially their faces and their brain cases, tell you something dizzying. They're already basically same species, same most recent branch of the human family. Brain volume in the same range as yours. The details are different. Their skulls are a little longer, lower, not quite the same globular shape you'd a CT scan of your own head. The face strikes you as familiar, though. You could walk past this person on a city street, give them jeans and a hoodie, and you probably wouldn't look twice. Those fossils pushed the origin of Homo sapiens back by more than 100,000 years. And they didn't just push it back in time, they pushed it wide in space. Because Jebel Irhoud is far from other early finds. It hints that your species was born in one tiny craterland, then spread like ink on paper. It suggests a pan-African evolution. Scattered populations across different regions of Africa, slowly exchanging genes, slowly converging on the anatomy that would one day be called modern human. So now the clock in your head has to adjust. You don't have a neat, short ramp leading up to us. You have hundreds of thousands of years with people who look like you, walk like you, who may have spoken languages structured enough to gossip and joke and argue, people living and dying, raising children, navigating dangers. The question that unsettles you comes back again. What were they doing all that time? To answer that, you have to lean closer to the meager traces they left. Not monuments, not books, stains, scratches, bits of color. One of the oldest signals your kind leaves that looks like us on the inside, as well as on the outside, is a color red. Somewhere around 200,000 years ago, still deep in Africa, you find evidence that people were processing ochre. Ochre is iron-rich earth. When you grind it, mix it with fat or water, it becomes pigment. It becomes something you can smear on skin, on stone, on objects. In some sites, you don't just see random pieces of this stuff. You see pieces that have been scraped, ground, intentionally shaped. You see what looks like a toolkit for making color. Why? Maybe it's for body paint before a hunt, to make everyone in the group look fierce or unified. Maybe it's for rituals, coming-of-age ceremonies, mourning the dead. Maybe it's for decoration, for beauty, for the pure joy of seeing your own skin turned a vivid, impossible shade. What matters is not that you know exactly what it meant. You don't. The meaning is gone. What matters is that meaning was there at all. Color isn't food. Color isn't a spear tip. Color is a symbol. It stands in for something else. When a group takes the time to mine, grind, store, and use pigment, they're telling you something about their inner world, ideas of identity, of status, of belonging, of us versus them, of today we are different from yesterday, because now we wear this color. Fast forward closer to 100,000 years ago, and another kind of small but enormous clue shows up: beads. Imagine picking up a small shell on a beach. It's smooth, satisfying to touch. Pretty, sure. But this shell, the ones found at these ancient sites, are just picked up and admired. They're pierced. They're worn. You see shells with holes or ground into them, in layers of earth about 100,000 years old. Often, they've traveled from the sea to inland sites. Someone brought them. Someone took the time to modify them, string them, maybe sew them onto clothing or hang them around a neck. A shell bee is a useless thing in the harsh calculus of immediate survival. You can't eat it. It won't keep you warm. It won't spare an antelope. But as a symbol, it can mark membership in a band. It can say, I'm part of this family, this clan, this group. I have reached a certain age, a certain role. It can whisper sexual availability, alliances, promises everything jewelry whispers in your world today. These beads are tiny, but they're loud. They say by 100,000 years ago, people like you were already living in a world saturated with signs. Around the same time, you start to see something else: intentional burials. Not just a body dropped wherever it fell, a body placed. You find skeletons arranged in ways that don't look like accidents, curled up, oriented in particular directions, maybe sprinkled with ochre. Sometimes there are objects within tools, pieces of animal, things that, to the living, clearly mattered. You have to be careful. It's easy to project your stories backward. Easy to say they believed in an afterlife or they already had complex religions. You don't know the specifics, but you do know this: it takes effort to bury someone like that. It takes coordination. It takes time you could be using for hunting or gathering. It takes an idea that the dead are not just trash to throw away or carrion to abandon. It takes some conception of the self that persists in the memory of others, maybe beyond the moment when breath stops. So by roughly 100,000 years ago, long before any of the famous cave paintings, long before any explosion of culture, you have color on purpose, jewelry on purpose, burials on purpose, that looks a lot like you. And here's where it gets even stranger. For much of this long stretch, your species is not alone. You exist in a world crowded with cousins, different kinds of humans, Neanderthals, dinosaurs, ANS, the small-bodied Homo floresiensis, and others are out there, on their own landscapes, under their own skies, working out their own solution, the same basic problems: how to eat, how to stay warm, how to bear children, how to make sense of a dangerous, beautiful world. The old cartoon image is brutal and drawing your ancestors as more human, these others as knuckle-dragging brutes. The evidence doesn't really support that kind of hierarchy. The other human species had big brains. They made tools. They adapted to harsh environments. They survived tens or hundreds of thousands of years. Sophisticated behaviors aren't a Homo sapiens monopoly. They're widespread. It's a very human thing, in the broadest sense of human. Picture the planet then, not as a single escalating march toward you, but as a complex web of different human-type groups, sometimes overlapping in geography, sometimes separated by mountains or seas, all of them clever, all of them navigating ice ages and wars, spells and predators. You, as Homo sapiens, are just one thread in that tapestry. At some point, those threads cross. You share the same valleys, the same coastlines. Firelight from another kind of human might be visible on a distant hillside. What did you feel? Seeing them? Curiosity? Fear? Recognition. The details of those encounters are mostly gone. What remains, scattered in tools and bowls and patterns of settlement, is a sense that this was a simple story of we being smarter and they being doomed. In fact, one of the big unsolved mysteries is why your branch is the one still here. Which brings you to a chapter scientists often label, cautiously, as some kind of cognitive revolution. It's not a revolution in the hardware so much as a shift in the software. Between about 70,000 and 60,000 years ago, the archaeological record in various places begins to change in a way that looks less like a slow drift and more like a spike. You start to see more complex tools, composite things made from multiple parts fitted together, blades shaped in increasingly refined ways, more abundant ornaments, beads, pendants, objects clearly made to be seen, more structured trade materials traveling long distances from where they originated, more elaborate burials with grave goods that seem to tell some kind of story about the person. To be clear, there are hints of all these things earlier. It's not that they appear from absolutely nowhere, but in this window, 70 to 60,000 years, you get what looks like an acceleration. Imagine watching a slow, fuzzy line on a graph suddenly bend upward. One way to picture it is this: the hardware, The big brain had been there for hundreds of thousands of years. At some point, the software boots up in a new mode. Language gets more complex, more layered. Symbols start to stack on top of symbols. The ability to think in myths, in big what-if stories, in complex social fictions becomes turbocharged. Maybe it was a single switch flip. Maybe it was many small increments, spread over regions and centuries, adding up. However it happened, the visible result is an explosion, behaviors that feel absolutely familiar to you. Now, connect this to something else that happens around the same period, a major wave of migration out of Africa. Your ancestors had walked out before, in smaller movements. But about 60,000 years ago, a wave of Homo sapiens moves out that, over time, goes everywhere. Follow them in your mind. Off the African coasts, along shorelines where food is rich and the climate is harsh but manageable. Into what will one day be called the Middle East, into Asia, looping around mountain ranges, crossing rivers. Some groups keep following coasts, exploiting fish and shellfish and what washes up from the sea. Others push inland. This isn't a single adventure. It's generation after generation of small decisions. Let's camp a little further this year. Let's see what's beyond that ridge. Let's stay where the herds seem to be going. Eventually, some of them reach the edge of what you now map as Southeast Asia, facing large islands and open water. To get to what you now call Australia, there is no way to simply walk. Even when sea levels drop in colder times, there are gaps that require crossing. So imagine sitting on a shoreline with people who have never seen your steel ships, your maps, your satellites. They don't have written navigation manuals. What they have is careful observation and cumulative knowledge. They know tides. They know currents. They know how the wind behaves at different times of year. They build something that floats. Logs lashed together, hollowed-out trunks, woven plant fibers. You don't know exactly what it looked like. Those materials rot. They don't fossilize. What you do know is that, by about 60,000 years ago and the tens of thousands of years after, humans like you are on Australia, which means somebody, or many somebody, built things that could carry people across water you cannot see across. They planned, they stocked, they set off toward a horizon that looked empty. That is not primitive. That is audacious. Other groups stern in other directions. Some move north and east, into colder lands where each winter tightens like a vice. They walk into regions where ice grips the world for long spans of time. This is the Ice Age setting you've seen in illustrations, mammoths, cold steppes, winds that cut like knives. You can't tough this out in a single layer of animal skin thrown over your shoulders. To live here you need technology, not just any clothing, tailored clothing. Garments that are fitted, closed, designed to keep heat in and wind out. That kind of clothing needs more than just hide and willpower. It needs tools that can pierce, pull, stitch. It needs the craft knowledge of how to shape something flat into something that wraps a moving body. So somewhere in a wind-scoured shelter, you can picture someone from your species, or maybe another human species, focusing on their hands, shaping tools, threading sinew through holes, adjusting a seam so it doesn't trap. Every stitch is a piece of theory applied to the real world. If I close it here, the cold stays out. If I wrap this, my child doesn't die of exposure tonight. Clothing is only one strand of the Ice Age toolkit. In some places, people take the bones of enormous animals, mammoths, creatures weighing more than trucks in your world, and use them like you would use beams and supports. They build structures out of bone, hide, and whatever else is at hand. You can imagine stepping inside one of these spaces. The air is heavy with the smell of smoke, cooked fat, damp fur. Voices murmur. Hands reach toward fire. Outside, the wind howls over open ground, scouring snow into ripples. Inside, There's a tiny pocket of controlled climate, created by human minds. And then there is hunting itself. Coordinated big game hunting isn't just a matter of running really fast with a spear. It's a problem in group strategy. You need scouts. You need ways of communicating over distance. Signals, gestures, maybe words shouted into the wind. You need to understand the behavior of the animals, where they migrate, where they're vulnerable, how they respond when panicked. Imagine planning a hunt that might take days, maybe weeks. You're making decisions about where to wait, when to move, how to funnel animals into a natural choke point. You visualize a landscape in your head, a mental map, and then overlay on that map the likely movements of other creatures. That's modeling. That's the beginning of the same mental machinery you use to plan traffic routes on shipping lanes. All this is happening while the climate lurches. Ice sheets advance, retreat, temperatures swing. What was a lush valley becomes a dry one. What was a rich coast becomes flooded. To survive, you can't be inflexible. You have to watch the world closely and shift. Change your prey. Change your camp. Change your tools. Adaptation isn't just biological. It's cultural. Your deep ancestors survived dramatic climates, wings not by growing new organs but by rewriting their shared behavioral code, again and again, over thousands of generations. Now, fold in something else happening in this same rough slice of time. Art. You were already playing with color and beads and burials before. But starting roughly 40,000 years ago, the evidence for artistic expression turns up the volume dramatically. Think about portable art first. Somewhere someone picks up a piece of bone, or ivory, or stone, and instead of just sharpening it into a tool, they start carving shapes that don't have any obvious practical function. Maybe it's a small figurine, an animal, a stylized human, some hybrid thing drawn from dreams or stories. Whatever the exact shape, the point is they're spending time making a miniature world. Then there's sound. Take a hollow piece of bone, perforate it. Adjust the spacing of the holes. You're essentially experimenting with air and vibration and pitch. You raise this object to your mouth and blow, and suddenly the night is full of something that didn't exist before music. Bone flutes, around 40,000 years old. They're fragile. They survive only in the rarest conditions. But the ones you do have are enough to tell you that somebody, somewhere, sat and tried different arrangements, listened, adjusted, refined. They weren't just making noise. They were searching for patterns that felt right. Notes that stirred something in the chest. Now imagine you, 40,000 years in the past, sitting in the mouth of a shelter as the light fades in the landscape, turns to charcoal lines against an darkening sky. Someone lifts this flute. Fingers cover and uncover the holes. A melody rises. Maybe it's wobbly. Maybe it's haunting. Maybe it's the same tune they've played for years, associated with a particular story, a particular memory. Music is not food. Music is not fire. But it binds. It synchronizes heartbeat and breath. It makes time feel different. It gives you a sense that you are part of something larger than your own single nervous system. And then there are the caves. Put yourself there. You're not walking into a tidy museum with railings and plaques. You're following someone from your band. Deeper and deeper underground. The light from torches throws moving shadows on the rock. The air cools. The outside world narrows to a memory. At some point, the passage opens into a chamber, and on the walls lit by flickering flame, you see animals, horses, big cats, creatures with horns. They're not stick figures. They're not clumsy. At a place you would call shoved in what will one day be known as France. Around 30,000 years ago, the paintings are astonishingly skilled. Lines curve with confidence. Bodies are shaded to suggest volume. Multiple legs blur together to create a sense of motion. like frames of animation overlaid. Stand there and watch, as the torchlight moves, how the animals themselves seem to move. A herd emerges from the ruck. A lion glides along the wall. Whoever made these images did more than just idly scratch. They understood the way light falls, the way your eye completes forms, the way your brain turns stillness into motion. They practiced. Maybe they learned it from someone else. Maybe they belonged to a lineage of painters whose names you will never know, but whose hands are visible in these strokes. Why did they do it? You don't know exactly. No one does. The walls don't come with subtitles. Maybe it was about hunting magic, rituals performed to bring success in the chase. Maybe it was about telling stories, teaching children about the animals, preserving knowledge. Maybe it was about visions, altered states, encounters with whatever was felt as beyond ordinary, whatever the motive. The result is clear. By 30,000 years ago, people with your brain were spending enormous effort in dangerous spaces to create images that no one absolutely needed for survival. It raises a humbling possibility. Maybe survival for humans has never been just about calories and shelter. Maybe stories and images and music were, from the very beginning, part of the survival package, not as luxuries, but as the glue that held minds and groups together. Now loop back to the social world these people moved through. You think of hunter-gatherers as perpetually struggling, always near starvation, living on the edge. But when anthropologists look at many hunter-gatherer groups, when they estimate how much time is actually spent obtaining food versus resting, socializing, making things, they often describe what you might call the original affluent society. Not affluent in objects, not affluent in stored wealth, affluent in time. If you don't have fields to weed, walls to repair, accounts to balance, buses to placate, your day looks different. Maybe you spend a few hours gathering and hunting. The rest, repairing tools, playing, sharing stories, making beads, painting bodies with ochre, singing. It's not paradise. There's danger, illness, conflict, but it's not an endless, grinding 12-hour shift at the food factory either. And something else is true of many hunter-gatherer societies. They're relatively egalitarian. If your wealth is meat that will rot if hoarded, or wild plants that have to be eaten soon, it's hard to accumulate permanent power just by stockpiling. Mobility is key. If someone becomes too domineering, too much of a tyrant, the group can, in many cases, just leave. Social pressure favors sharing, modesty, balance. There are no thrones, no skyscrapers, no titles carved in stone. There are relationships dense, overlapping, constantly negotiated. To live this way, you need an astonishing amount of knowledge. You need to know thousands of plant species which nourish, which heal, which poison. You need to recognize tracks in mud or snow, read the angle of a broken twig, notice how birds behave differently when predators are near. You need to remember the stories associated with particular places along your route, where the water will still be flowing in a dry season, where the berries ripen first, where lightning once struck and changed the land. This is a different kind of library. Not shells of paper, but minds, interconnected, each holding a piece of the shared encyclopedia. Lose elders. You don't just lose personalities. You lose chapters. From the Jebel Irhoud, people grinding out an existence, more than 300,000 years ago, to foragers stopping to string beads and bury their dead with care 100,000 years ago, to Ice Age bands painting caves and playing music and coordinating massive hunts, to the builders of Göbekli Tepe raising stones in circles under the naked sky. Through all of this, it's one continuous thread. Humans like you, using a big brain, not just to suffer through existence, but to fill it with layers of meaning. Look again at Göbekli Tepe now, at those carved pillars about 11,600 years ago. No farms, no cities. And yet these pillars stand in rings, some bearing images. They're heavy enough that moving just one would be a major project for a small community. Dozens means planning over seasons, maybe over generations. People might travel from long distances to gather here. Why? The most straightforward guess is that this is a ritual center, a place of gatherings that are about more than hunting coordination or trading materials. Maybe myths are told here, stories of beginnings, of other than human beings, of the rules that hold your world together. Whatever exactly happened on that hill, one thing is clear: sophisticated spiritual or religious life does not wait politely for agriculture and civilization to arrive before it begins. It's already here, fully flowering, in the minds of hunter-gatherers. If you take a step back from the specific sites and dates, a picture starts to emerge from all this scattered evidence. Your deep past is not a flat, grey expanse of boredom punctuated only at the end by real history. It's a long, slow accumulation of tricks and tools and habits, grinding ochre into meaning, drilling shells into identity, placing bodies into graves that say, "This person mattered," living alongside other human species, all of you sophisticated in your own ways. Booting up more complex symbolics software around 70 to 60,000 years ago, pouring out art and music and myth into caves, portable objects, flutes, dances, crossing seas without compasses, building houses of bone on frozen plains, organizing life in bands that, for all their dangers, often allowed more communal time and less monotonous labor than many of your modern schedules. And then, near the end of this long prehistory, another shift. The ice retreats. In some regions, climates become more stable, warmer, wetter. Plants that you've been gathering for millennia become more predictable. Animals you've been tracking start to gather in certain places more reliably. Somewhere, actually, in multiple somewheres, people begin to experiment. They linger a little longer in places where certain plants grow thick. They notice that when seeds spill, when bits of root are left behind, those spots are richer next season. They start to clear a patch here, protect a patch there. Maybe they scare off other animals that would eat what they now think of quietly at first as their food. At the same time, they follow herds, like they always have. But now, instead of only chasing and killing, they begin to shape which animals stay near them, which ones breed, which ones are spared. Gradually, over lifetimes, the line between wild and ours blurs. This isn't an overnight revolution. No one wakes up one morning and declares, "Today we invent agriculture." It's more like a sliding, almost unconscious change in rhythms. Less moving, more staying put, more investment in particular patches of land, more food in some years than the group could possibly eat at once. And when you can produce more food than you immediately need, something new appears in the human story: surplus. Surplus means you can feed more children, so population starts to rise. Surplus means you can get through lean seasons at least some of the time. Surplus also means some people can, for part of the year, step away from directly getting food and do other things. Houses become more solid. Not just temporary shelters and bone frameworks on the ice, but structures meant to withstand multiple seasons, maybe multiple generations. Storage pits appear, clay containers, woven baskets, whatever works to keep grain or dried food safe from pests and rot. Once you can store, you can also accumulate. And once you can accumulate, the social equations change. In a band of foragers, when he trots fast and berries bruise easily, there are natural limits on how much an individual can possess. The group keeps anyone from getting to big ahead by teasing, by moving away, by sharing norms that punish arrogance. But in a village with storage, with fenced fields or marked patches, with herds kept close, someone can control more than their immediate share. Maybe it's the person who first had the idea. Maybe it's the person who calls down the spirits at the right time. Maybe it's the person with the strongest alliances. Hierarchies that were once flexible and mostly informal can harden. You get leaders whose word carries more weight, not just today but tomorrow and the day after. You get people who oversee, people who are intermediaries between the group and gods or ancestors. People whose status is maintained even if they're not the ones planting or harvesting. Villages grow. Paths between them become more traveled. Goods move along those paths. So do stories, songs, marriage partners, obligations. Managing all this with memory alone becomes harder. At some point, in some of these settled societies, people begin to leave marks, not just pictures of animals on cave walls, but signs that stand in for something abstract. Sounds, names, quantities, promises. Maybe at first they're simple tallies and symbols only a few people understand. Over time, in some places, those marks become full systems writing. Once that happens, by the way we use the word history begins, you can see why technically. The moment people start recording events, laws, accounts, in marks that last, you move into a world where later generations can read, almost word for word, what earlier people wanted to say. But now you can also see the trap. If you think human story equals written story, then almost everything you've just walked through together, hundreds of thousands of years of experiment, adaptation, art, ritual, migration, coexisting with other human species, the entire ramp-up of what it means to be this peculiar animal with language and myth, that all get shoved into a tiny, poorly lit room called prehistory and mostly ignored. From the first faces like yours at Jebel Irhoud, more than 300,000 years ago, to the appearance of the first real texts, maybe 5 or 6,000 years ago, is a vast stretch. Yet when you zoom out, the written slice is a sliver at the very edge, a hairline scratch on the clock. Most of what made you human happened before anyone wrote it down. Those long, unwritten ages are where your nervous system was molded, where your emotional defaults were wired. Think about what it meant to survive for that span of time. For almost all of it, your ancestors lived in small groups where everyone knew everyone else, where your reputation could mean life or death, where exile was almost the same thing as a death sentence. Your brain learned it, over generations, to be exquisitely sensitive to social cues, to care desperately about belonging, to feel physical pain when you are rejected. For almost all of it, threats came mostly in the form of immediate, concrete dangers, predators, storms, enemies near enough that you could smell them. Your stress system evolved to dump everything into you, fast, heart racing, muscles ready, hyper-focus, so you could either fight or run or sometimes freeze. For almost all of it, you got your information from the landscape and the people physically near you, the sky, the tracks on the ground, the mood in the camp, the stories by the fire. Your software was shaped by this environment, a world where deep knowledge of place and community was the main survival tech, where status was negotiated face to face, where meaning was carried in myth that everyone knew by heart. Then, very late, in that small, last percent of the story, agriculture and villages and stockpiles and writing appear. Cities rise, states form, kingdoms, religions with scriptures, bureaucracies, empires, eventually machines, eventually, global networks and streaming media, and you listening to a voice in the dark that comes from nowhere in particular. Your brain, though, it's still mostly running code optimized for the older world. When you feel a spike of shame, reading a comment someone leaves on a screen, that's an ancient alarm system designed for a camp where a handful of disapproving faces could mean you might not be fed tomorrow. When you lie awake replaying an awkward interaction, that's the same machinery that once scanned for subtle shifts in tone or gesture around the fire. When a buzzing in your pocket or a number on an app kicks your body into stress, That circuitry that once went on high alert at the crack of a twig, the sudden hush of birds, the whisper that another band had been seen nearby. Here is the strange part that old nervous system is, in many ways, overpowered for your current input stream. It was built for clear, immediate threats and tangible community. Now it's bombarded by abstract worries, distant disasters you can do nothing about, symbols on a glowing rectangle. No wonder it feels off. But if you trace the line back through deep time, this mismatch stops feeling like a personal failure and starts to read as a perfectly predictable side effect of your species' timeline. For hundreds of millennia, groups like yours developed ways of living that, in many places, kept them in a kind of dynamic balance with their environments. If you hunted, you moved, or you suffered and learned. If you destroyed the plants you relied on, you paid for it within a generation. The feedback loops were short and brutal. Hunter-gatherer life was not an untouched Eden. People changed landscapes with fire, with hunting, with choices. But the scale and speed of change were tethered to the capacities of bodies and stone and bone. There was no engine to accelerate extraction beyond what the immediate world could show you. Agriculture changes that equation. Slowly at first, then faster. Suddenly you can push an ecosystem harder, for longer, without immediate collapse, because you're storing, redirecting, irrigating. You're making the land produce more of a few favored species at the expense of diversity. You're riding the curve where population grows along with the food supply. From a narrow, genetic point of view, this is success. More humans, more copies of human genes, fanning out across landscapes. From the point of view of an individual body, especially early on, it could be rough. Stiffer joints from repetitive labor. Less varied diets. Crowded settlements where diseases can leap from person to person. Rigid hierarchies where some lives count much more than others. You could say agriculture was a rodeo for many individuals and a jackpot for the species over all numbers. Both things can be true, and that doubleness runs through the whole story. The same capacities that let people carve those pillars at Gobi Klit Corporation, shared imagination, willingness to work for something invisible and sacred will later be harnessed to raise monuments for kings and gods of empires, to fight wars, to build systems that generate vast wealth for some and grinding labor for others. The gifts that let someone, 30,000 years ago, paint running horses in flickering torchlight are the same gifts that today let a stranger on another continent create an image that moves you to tears, or design an interface that quietly hijacks your attention. You inherit all of it. You carry in your skull a brain sculpted in campfire's glow, tuned to landscapes you may never see, full of instincts that are sometimes beautifully right and sometimes hilariously misapplied to your current surroundings. And you carry, in your collective memory, only the faintest written trace of how that brain came to be. Most of the real story is not in books. It's in bones and stones and soil. It's in genic patterns and scattered sites. It's in the way certain melodies feel inevitable, certain stories recurring culture after culture, certain fears and longings surface, no matter how modern the setting. When you look at the whole sweep, those early people in Africa whose faces would not look out of place on a subway, the ones who pressed red ochre into paste, the ones who strung shells, the ones who laid bodies carefully into the earth and left signs that they felt something beyond mere disposal, the ones who watched the glaciers pull back and followed rivers into new lands, the ones who stepped on 2 small boats and to Australia, the ones who walked and paddled and coasted their way into the Americas, you begin to get a different sense of what kind of creature you are. Not a thin, recent invention of cities and screens. Not the product of only the last few thousand years of kings and laws and wars. What you actually are is a very old animal, wearing very new clothes, Not old as in a few generations back. Some sepia-owned great-grandparents in stiff colors. Old as in, your kind has watched ice sheets scrape across continents and then vanish again. Your kind has walked undisguised with unfamiliar stars, because the whole pattern of the heavens hundreds of thousands of nights. Your kind has sat at fireside so many times that firelight might as well be hardcode into your nervous system. And none of that shows up in your school timeline. On paper, you appear out of nowhere with the first cities, the first names carved into stone, the first lockouts and chronicles and wars that someone bothered to record. That whole huge stretch before words on clay or ink on paper, people tend to wave it away with one vague label and move on. But your body didn't wave it away. Your brain didn't skip it. It was forged there. You are moving through a hyper-complex, concrete minus glass, algorithm managed world with a nervous system that was tuned in excruciating detail for a very different kind of life. Call it your Stone Age brain if you like. Same size as those early ancestors. Same basic architecture. Same reward systems. Same threat detectors. Same hunger for stories, faces, patterns. The hardware is ancient. The environment is brand new. Once you start seeing that mismatch, a lot of your daily weirdness suddenly stops feeling so mysterious. Take stress. On paper, you live in one of the safest periods your species has ever experienced. You probably aren't going to be ambushed by a predator on the way to the bathroom. You're unlikely to starve this week. There is no spear-armed rival band camped just beyond the next hill. And yet your heart races when you open your inbox. Your stomach clenches when you see a number on a bank app. You lie awake reviewing conversations and imagined catastrophes. From the outside, that's absurd. From the inside of a brain shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of hunting, gathering, and constant scanning for subtle cues of danger, it makes a certain what sense you carry. And you didn't ask for this a set of reflexes, tuned for a world where threats were sudden and physical, and where missing a signal could be fatal. A rustle in the brush, shift in the wind, a look on someone's face around the fire. Your alarm system was built to err on the side of better safe than dead. So when a notification pops up, when a deadline approaches, when you sense disapproval in someone's text or silence in a chat, that ancient system does what it has always done. It urges. It dials everything up. It prepares you to respond fast. The trouble is, the predators in your world don't resolve in a short sprint or a brief confrontation. They linger as open tabs, unsent emails, unresolved conflicts, numbers that go up or down slowly over years. Your Stone Age brain keeps trying to treat chronic, abstract problems like immediate, physical threats. No wonder it feels frayed. Then there's loneliness. Your ancestors spent virtually their entire lives embedded in small, tightly woven bands of people. Dozens of faces, not thousands. Familiar voices, not a flood of anonymous text. A village's worth of relationships that you could, with some effort, keep track of who had which skills, who could be trusted in which ways, who was nursing grief, who was quietly furious. You were tuned for that. For daily eye contact, for shared tasks, for sleeping within earshot of other breathing bodies, other waking watchful minds, for touching the same people every day, passing tools, sharing food, holding children that were yours and not yours. Your brain grew up as a species, in a world where being cut off from your group didn't just mean a bit's add tonight. It meant you might not live. So social pain, rejection, exclusion, that sixth sense that you're on the outside looking in, registers in your nervous system as something close to physical pain. It's not metaphorical when people say a breakup hurts. That's your deep time, hardware calmly informing you that isolation has always been a serious threat. Now drop that exquisitely social brain into a modern pattern of life where you can, very easily, spend entire days surrounded by strangers and screens, rarely locking eyes, rarely moving in synchrony, rarely feeling yourself part of a small group facing the world together. You feel something is off, unsettled, thin. You scroll. You like and comment and send little symbols back and forth, and for a moment your brain gets a micro-minus dose of recognition, little flickers that echo genuine connection. But deep down, your old circuitry is waiting for the things it was promised across those hundreds of thousands of campfires, bodies near yours. Shared effort, joint attention on the same piece of reality, a landscape, an animal track, a child's face, a task that actually matches to your group's survival. It's not that the modern ways of connecting are fake. It's that they're incomplete relative to what your biology expects. If you feel a constant, low-level hunger for something more solid, more embodied, more mutual, that's not a personal failing. That's your pedigree speaking. Or think about why it's so hard to sit still and stare at a wall of abstract symbols for 8 hours. Your ancestors absolutely could pay attention for long stretches. Tracking an animal, watching the weather, listening to an elder tell a story that contained vital knowledge about where to find water next year. But what they were monitoring always had clear stakes, and it was almost never purely symbolic, floating free of the physical world. You, on the other hand, ask your ancient attention systems to focus on rows of numbers, flows of digital messages, bureaucratic forms, algorithmic dashboards, things you can't touch, can't smell, can't immediately link to food or warmth or danger. Your brain can do it. It's absurdly flexible, but it tires fast. It sneaks away. You tab over. You reach for your phone. You crave some hint of the concrete news about other humans, images of faces and bodies and landscapes, anything that feels like the world it evolved to handle. Again, not because you're lazy or undisciplined or broken, because you are running ancient firmware in an environment it was never specifically tuned for. Seen from that angle, so many of your problems soften around the edges. You can stop a little hating yourself for being anxious, for being hungry for validation, for being distracted, for wanting to belong so badly it sometimes aches. Those traits were survival features for most of your species' existence. They just fire in strange directions now. Underneath every app-inhabitant coping mechanism, there's this long, unbroken lineage of bodies moving through forests and grasslands and along coasts. There's a background image your mind still holds. Open sky, changing light, the voices of people you know well, cycles you trust, the return of certain fruits, the rebirth of certain plants after rain, animals moving along predictable paths. That environment is what sculpted you. For a tiny scale your conscious mind can barely grasp. Your kind lived as part of living systems, not as something hovering over them. When you zoom out that far, one stark fact stands out for the entire span before cities and kingdoms and written chronicles. Humans survived by learning the grain of their ecosystems, intimately unfitting themselves into it. They knew, down to small details, what they could take without breaking the pattern. That doesn't mean they were gentle saints. Your ancestors hunted. They burned. They changed landscapes. They almost certainly drove some creatures to local extinction. They made mistakes that cost lives. But the broad pattern is this: they lived in ways that over and over again allowed the plants and animals and waters around them to renew. They had to. There was no distant surplus. No hidden warehouse, no external fuel stream. Ruined the land around you, and you felt it within seasons. So the groups that lasted generation after generation in the same region were the ones that found a rough balance, the ones that learned, sometimes through disaster, where the edges were. They didn't have the word sustainability. They didn't draw graphs of carbon cycles. They had stories. Stories about when you go here and when you don't. about which animal you never kill at that season, about this grove you never cut because someone long ago did and something bad followed. They folded ecological pattern into myth and ritual and taboo, because that's how you store complex, practical knowledge in a brain like yours. Not as bullet points in a manual, but as living narratives that children absorb long before they can reason abstractly. You can almost picture some of those ancestral bands living through changes that would terrify you, a dry period stretching longer than anyone remembers, a winter that doesn't end in time. Animals not migrating when they should. They looked to the sky, at the tracks at each other. They adjusted, moved their camps, shifted what they hunted or gathered that season, tried something else, not always successfully, not always kindly, but across the full sweep, what the archaeological traces show. Small sites built and abandoned, tools made from local materials, evidence of people staying on the move rather than locking a single landscape into permanent, intensive extraction, is that your kind is capable of living in dynamic balance with the rest of life, capable of moving, season after season, in step with what the land can give. That capacity did not vanish when someone first scratched symbols onto clay. It's still in you. It's there in the way your body relaxes, almost against your will, when you step under trees or near water. It's there in how your sense of time shifts when you watch a sunrise or sit through a storm without trying to use the time for something productive. It's there in the strange, almost guilty pleasure you feel when you do something with your hands. Cook, plant, fix, build, and can see and touch the result. Some quiet part of you recognizes those as home operations. This is one of the humbling and oddly comforting implications of deep time, the modern story. You grew up with the story that starts with kings and empires and marches quickly to industry and internet is barely a footnote in your full biography. If you take the history of your kind as, say, 300,000 years, and you give history class those last 5,000, the times of scribes and chroniclers and bureaucratic records, all those famous names and dates and wars and inventions, live in less than 2% of the total timeline. 2%. 98% of your story is what we call prehistory. Not because nothing happened, but because no one was keeping a ledger with written symbols we can still read. Almost everything that makes you human: language, music, shared laughter, the urge to decorate, grief at gravesides, that sharp adolescent sense of injustice, the satisfaction of mastering a skill, the intricate dance of cooperation and drivery was already fully alive before anyone etched the first line of official script. You are the heir of that enormous and documented stretch. You come from a line that endured every climate swing of the last few 100,000 years, that walked and paddled into almost every habitable niche on the planet, that learned how to read tracks in mud and stars in the sky, how to coax fire from almost nothing, how to share food in ways that bound groups together rather than tearing them apart. Your existence right now, in whatever room you're in, is the end point so far of an unbroken chain of success stories. Every single one of your direct ancestors, going back not just a few generations but all the way into that deep past, survived long enough to have at least one child who survived long enough to do the same, again and again, across ice ages and droughts and migrations and disasters. You come from survivors, from improvisers, from people who found ways through. That doesn't mean they were better than the other humankinds who shared the world with them. It doesn't mean there was something morally superior about your particular lineage. The reasons one branch of humanity endured while others vanished are tangled. Climate shifts, luck, networks, timing. But from your perspective, with your heartbeat, your breath, it means this. You are the living tip of an ancient spear of resilience. The language you think in, the way you scan a room for mood, the tilt of your pelvis when you walk, the way your hands curl around tools, All of it was carried he run countless backs and in countless ones across landscapes that would take your breath away. Whenever you feel small and insignificant, lost in the noise of modern life, you can remember that. You contain, silently, the whole story. The problem is your culture mostly only honors that last sliver, that tiny closing bracket on the right side of the timeline. We build monuments to the recent. We memorize the names of rulers and revolutionaries. We fetishize innovation measured over years, or at most centuries, and we call the entire rest primitive, simple, background. But if you flip it, if you treat the vast, long, unwritten stretch as primary, and our brief, literate experiment as the weird exceptional case, it shifts something in how you see everything around you. Those towers of steel and glass, those global supply chains, those glowing rectangles in every owner's hands, those servers humming in windowless rooms. They stop looking like inevitable progress marching forward in a straight line, and more like a wild detour. A sudden, rapid divergence from the older pattern of life. A divergence that has given you astonishing powers: medicine, communication, knowledge, minus, and also wrapped your Stone Age brain in stresses and temptations it never had to handle before: infinite food, infinite novelty, infinite news, infinite comparison. That brain is still trying to do what it always did: keep you alive, keep you bonded, keep you attuned to threats and opportunities. So it uses the tools at hand. Instead of watching the horizon for weather, it watches the news feed. Instead of tracking the changing pattern of bird calls, it monitors social cues. Instead of feeling its way through seasons on a landscape, it feels its way through months and years of contracts, projects, apps, and planes. Sometimes it does well. Sometimes it's short minus circuits. You can feel both truths at once, that you are astonishingly adaptable, and that you are somewhat out of your depth. The deep minus time viewed doesn't solve that tension for you, but it gives you a frame. It lets you ask, each time you run into some friction in your life, is this a personal flaw, or is this my ancient wiring reacting predictably to a very strange context? When you find yourself compulsively checking a device late at night, scanning for any new sign that you are still connected, still included, remember the small bands under the stars. Where being left out really could mean mortal danger. When you sit all day under artificial light, your body growing louder and louder in its discomfort, trying to get you to move, to change your visual field, to let your eyes refocus on something far away. Remember that, for almost all of your past, you would have been walking, bending, reaching, lifting, squatting as a normal part of gathering and making. When you feel an odd hollow whiz after buying something, you got the thing, but the satisfaction fades almost instantly. Remember that for most of your species' history, the deepest pleasures were bound up with effort and togetherness, making something with others, hunting and splitting the carcass, crafting tools or ornaments slowly over days. It's not that you have to flee the modern world and try to literally reenact some imagined ancestral life. You can't. The land is different. There are billions more people. The context has changed beyond recognition. But you can listen to what your old brain is telling you. You can notice that you sleep more deeply when you let yourself see the sky change from light to dark, instead of staring into bright blue-white light until the moment you close your eyes. You can feel that your anxiety drops when you have a handful of people you see regularly in the flesh with whom you can share both fun and vulnerability. You can feel that some part of you relaxes when you touch soil, foods, wood, stone, water. When you pay attention to the seasons not as decorations on a calendar, but as shifts in temperature, light, and life that you move through with your body. Those are not fads. Those are your inheritance. The other piece of inheritance, though, is more subtle. It's not just that your brain and body were shaped by this long, unwritten stretch. It's that you carry, whether you know it or not, The memory of something we've mostly only glimpsed in fragments, the capacity of human groups to live over long spans, in relative harmony with the ecosystems that sustain them. You live in a moment where it's easy to believe the opposite. You grow up with stories of environmental collapse and habitat loss. You see graphs that show upward lines of extraction and downward lines of biodiversity. You're told that humans are, almost by nature, a destructive force, a kind of planetary error. From a civilization perspective, that tiny, recent sliver, there's truth in that fear. The scale and speed of your species' recent impact is staggering. The technologies of the last few centuries have allowed you to change things faster than your governance or your ethics can keep up. But if you widen the time frame, if you zoom back to include those 10 times, 20 times longer eras when all humans were foragers, the picture becomes more nuanced. You see groups that, for countless generations, lived in places without turning them into deserts or empty seas. You see strategies that, while far from perfect, were at least viable over millennia, moving with the seasons instead of trying to force a single patch of land to give year minus round, taking what you needed and then leaving areas to recover. Those strategies weren't the result of inherent virtue. They were enforced by reality. If you overshoot in a small group, with no external inputs, you feel it quickly. Your children go hungry. Your elders weaken. Stories are told about what went wrong and what not to do next time. Over time, that feedback loop writes itself into culture. That's the part that the last few thousand years have, in some places, interrupted. Surpluses, storage, long minus distance strayed, fossil fuels, these things weaken and stretch the feedback loop. You can image your immediate surroundings and still feel fine, for quite a while, because you're drawing from somewhere, or somewhen else. It's in that stretch, that lag, that a lot of your current crises live. But the capacity for tighter feedback, for tuning life to what your environment can actually support, that has not been deleted from the human repertoire. It's there in the deep code. You catch glimpses of it whenever someone learns the migratory pattern of birds in a particular area, or understands the subtle timing of when a certain plant can be harvested without harming it. Whenever people reorganize their lives around cycles of light and dark, heat and cold, instead of around abstract deadlines. And you can feel the longing for that kind of groundedness in yourself. It shows up as a vague ache when you read about collapsing ecosystems, as a sense of unreality when you spend a whole day never seeing the sky, as the sudden joy you feel when you manage to grow even the smallest thing, a herb on a windowsill, a vegetable in a planter, and taste it. You are not separate from the rest of life. You are a peculiar, talkative, tool-minus intensive branch of it. For the longest time, that branch moved in rough rhythm with the others. That doesn't guarantee you will do so again, on a large scale. But it means it's possible. It means there is no iron law that humans must always and only wreck their surroundings. Some of your ancestors, a long time ago, figured out how not to. They didn't write it down. They showed it by still being there, living, children laughing, fires burning, generation after generation, in the same river valleys, the same coast, the same clearings in the forest. Think about what that does to your sense of what's possible. You are told that the future is either endless growth or collapse, that it's either this way of living intensified, or a return to some brutal regression. The deep past whispers a third option: adaptation, not a return to some frozen natural state, but a continual adjustment, guided by close attention to what actually works over time. A dance, not a march. Your line has danced through heat and cold, abundance and scarcity, new landscapes and unfamiliar creatures. It has done so with a brain that is, essentially, the same one you carry now. That's the through line. So when you lie there, maybe right now, thinking about your own small troubles and the massive, ominous problems flickering at the edge of your awareness, climate change, social fragmentation, technological upheaval. You can remember this: your Stone Age brain is not just a liability. It's also your main asset. It was built for improvisation under pressure, for reading complex social fields, for finding patterns, spotting opportunities, telling stories that hold groups together, imagining futures and acting toward them. Everything you fear about that brain, that it is impulsive, tribal, emotional, is also what makes it capable of compassion, loyalty, courage, and the stubborn, irrational hope that tomorrow might be better. Underneath all the abstractions, that's what carried your kind through the 98% of your story that no one wrote down. That's what you were heir to. So what do you do with that knowledge? To the scale of one life. You're not going to personally redesign your entire civilization. You won't rewrite the last few thousand years. You can't suddenly erase the concrete or the code or the grids of power you were born into. But you can begin quietly to live as someone who remembers the oldest story. You can listen to your stress and ask, not how do I make this go away, but what is my old brain trying to protect me from, and is it seeing clearly? Sometimes the answer will be it's reacting to illusions, to ghost threats dressed in the clothing of real ones. Sometimes the answer will be no. This is a real misfit between how I live and what I need. You can treat your loneliness as a signal worth heeding, not as a shameful evidence of your unlovability, but as an honest report from a creature designed to be in a small, known circle of others. You can, to the extent your circumstances allow, move toward that fewer, deeper connections, more face-to-face time, more shared tasks, more mutual care. You can notice when your environment is starving your senses, when all your inputs are second-hand images of nature instead of nature, text about people instead of people, and you can, even in tiny doses, seek the real thing, a park instead of a picture, a conversation instead of a comment, a walk instead of another thread. You can let your body remember its old repertoire: squatting, lifting, carrying, reaching, not as exercise, a chore to offset sedentary work, but as normal, satisfying ways a primate like you move through space. You can give the ancient parts of your mind, where they have always loved, stories told in person, songs sung aloud, rituals that mark transitions, shared meals where food moves from common dishes to many hands. And on a larger, slower scale, you can let the deep timeline recalibrate your sense of urgency and despair. Your culture hurls images at you that compressed into news cycles, product cycles, election cycles. It tells you that everything must be solved now, that any setback is final, that any gain is permanent. The bones and stones and layers of ash in the ground tell a different story. They say things have been dire before. They say no single arrangement of human life is permanent. They say your kind has, repeatedly, faced environments that changed faster than your traditions and muddled through in surprising ways. This doesn't guarantee rescue. It doesn't mean you can relax and wait for some automatic correction. But it does undercut the narrative that says we're doomed because humans are simply like this and cannot be otherwise. You have been otherwise for far longer than you have been like this. When you remember that the chronicle you learn in school, those few thousand years of conquest and empire, of slavery and patriarchy and extraction, is only the last 2% of the human experiment, the absolute floor of what you can imagine shifts. You can start to picture ways of living that are different, not by inventing them from scratch, but by listening to the faint echoes from that older, unwritten majority of your story. Loose hierarchies, shared childcare, work that blends with socializing, deep, place-based knowledge, rituals that bind communities to each other and to their land, measures of success that center not just accumulation, but continuation. Will this still work? Beautifully. For my grandchildren, none of that is about nostalgia. It's about memory. The few lines of script and the many terabytes of data that document the last sliver of your history can make it feel like that sliver is all there is. But beneath them, consolidating away in the dark, are those hundreds of thousands of years when your kind experimented with being human in ways that left almost no tidy records. You are not that ignorance. You are that experiment. Tonight, or whenever you happen to be hearing this, you are one more node in a network that stretches back through all of that time. You are lying down in a room instead of a hut or a shelter built from bone and hide. Your light is electric instead of from a flame. The sounds outside are engines instead of insects or wind or distant animal calls. But biologically, psychologically, you're not very different from someone who, 50,000 years ago, lay down near a fire, listening to it crackle, feeling the weight of the day. They too worried. They too loved. They too thought about the future and about what would happen to their children and about what the weather would be like next season. You read the same story in a new chapter. You carry a Stone Age brain with its blunt arms and fine social antennae inside a techno-civilization shell. You carry, coded into each cell, the memory of living in balance with places not perfectly, not without impact, but with a feedback loop tight enough that life went on. You live in a world that often teaches you to despise that older part of yourself, to see it only as a source of bias, aggression, irrationality, to imagine that your best hope lies in transcending it, becoming more machine-like, more rational, less animal. But maybe the task is not to escape it. Maybe the task is to befriend it, to recognize that the same deep circuits that make you overreact to a snub can make you fiercely loyal, that the same sensitivity to threats that makes you perceptive of subtle danger, to yourself and to others, that the same craving for belonging that drives you to conform can be harnessed to build groups that uphold each other in healthier ways. Your ancestors used those circuits to cooperate in ways an animal quite has, to share intentions, to build cumulative culture, to pass on knowledge that let children solve problems their grandparents never faced. Those circuits built all of this. They are not obsolete. They're just out of context. And context can change over the coming decades, centuries. Your descendants, if you have them, if they have them, if your line continues, will face their own strange transitions. The climate will shift, the sea will move, technologies will come and go that you cannot imagine. They will face those challenges with the same underlying brain, tuned by the same ancient pressures, plus whatever new layers culture adds on top. What you do now, how you treat your own Stone Age brain, how you treat the ecosystems you're entangled with, how you shape your tiny piece of culture feeds into that. Your life is small, unimaginably small, next to 300,000 years. And your life is huge because you are the only place where all of that time becomes conscious right now. In this moment, you're the only point where that entire lineage gets to say, here I am. I see this. I feel this. I choose. So as you let yourself drift toward sleep, or toward whatever comes next after this listening, you might try a different kind of self-talk. Not the usual barrage of self-judgment, the running critique of your productivity and your status. Something more like, I am a very old animal, living in a very new world. Of course it feels strange. Of course it hurts sometimes. Of course I don't always fit. And also, I come from people who figured things out, who watched the sky and the ground and each other and made it through. You are not just a worker, or a username, or a citizen of some recent nation. You are the current expression of a deep, resilient, creative lineage that has been improvising solutions in the dark for hundreds of thousands of years. Written history barely skims the surface of that ocean. It gives you the last ripples. But the swell underneath, the slow, powerful movement, that's what actually made you. When you wake up tomorrow, the same notifications will be waiting. The same to-do lists. the same unsolved problems, at every scale. But if you carry this other timeline quietly in the back of your mind, you might move through them a little differently, with a bit more patience for your own quirks, with a bit more tenderness for other people's, with a bit more curiosity about how to live in ways that would still make sense if you zoomed all the way out. You might pause, once or twice, to look at the sky, as if you're seeing it not just with your own eyes, but with the accumulated gaze of everyone who ever looked up and wondered what comes next. You might feel, just for a second, the strange, solid comfort of knowing that, whatever happens in this tiny, bright fragment of time, you are part of something much larger than any empire, any economy, any trend. You are human. You have been human for a very long time, and the story is not over yet. Think of it almost like logging into an account you forgot you had. All your life, you've been using the latest version of the app cities, schedules, screens, assuming that's the whole service, and then someone quietly hands you a password and says, "Hey, there's an archive here. Hundreds of thousands of years of patch notes, beta tests, abandoned features, brilliant designs that never made it into the current build, and some that did invisibly. You don't get to read the full changeling. The record's burned. The storage medium was bone and hidden story and gesture, but you can feel the inheritance in your own reactions. The way your shoulders drop when you're near trees or water, the way a shared meal cons parts of you no medication quite reaches. The way a song, especially with other people's voices braided into it, can rearrange your sense of what's bearable. Those aren't glitches. They're ancestral functions. For almost all of your species' existence, that was the operating environment. Small bands, shared risks, landscapes known in obsessive detail, nights punctuated by firelight and stars and stories about where you came from and where you go when you die. No written theology, no printed law codes, no recorded lectures, and yet rules, rituals, taboos, myth, ethics, training regimes, all running unspoken language and remembered example. If you close your eyes now, you can do a version of what they did. You can place yourself, not in some abstract prehistoric time that feels like a cartoon, but in a specific evening. Maybe you are on a step at the edge of a retreating ice sheet, air so clear it almost hurts to breathe. Maybe you are in a forest, dampened heavy with the smell of soil and leaf and animal. Maybe you are on a coastline, hearing waves you can't see in the dark, knowing that beyond that black line is distance your feet will never cross. You've eaten, you're retired. The day had its scares and its small victories. Someone is telling a story by the fire. It might be about a hunt that went wrong. It might be about the first people and where they came out of the ground or down from the sky. It might be about a relative who died, woven into a tale about what happens beyond breath. You listen. Your nervous system, your attention span, your susceptibility to rhythm and surprise, they are the same ones you use now when you scroll a feed or binge a show. The medium changed. The circuitry didn't. When archaeologists brush dirt off a bone flute, or find the worn spot where fingers grit the tool, or uncover a cluster of buried bodies dusted with red ochre and surrounded by objects that clearly mattered, they're not just cataloging artifacts. They're catching snapshots of your own interior architecture in use. The urge to decorate surfaces with images. The impulse to mark death with current symbol. The compulsion to tinker with materials until they do something new. Somewhere in those long, missing years, your ancestors walked out of Africa, met and mingled with other humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and crossed seas to reach Australia, followed herds and coastlines into the Americas, watched ice advance and retreat, invented ways to stay warm and dry and fed in conditions that would break most of us in a week. And all of that happened before a single king wrote his name on a monument. Long before fields were fenced and grains domesticated and villages turned into towns. People were already building things that didn't make obvious economic sense, vast ritual sites, carefully painted caves, carefully tended graves. Whatever else they were doing, they were thinking about meaning. You inherit that, too. So when you lie awake wondering what your life is for, or why any of this matters, you're not malfunctioning. You're running the same background processes that were there when someone, 10 or 20,000 generations back, looked up at unfamiliar stars and felt that same ache. Maybe that's the strangest comfort this whole deep time perspective can offer you. Not that everything will work out, they didn't always. Not that your species is special in some cosmic, guaranteed way. Just this confusion and grief and stubborn joy are not modern problems. They are core features of the package, and so is the capacity to adapt. People survived sudden droughts and bitter winters, volcanoes and plagues and migrations across unthinkable distances. Sometimes they failed. Often they failed, but enough of them learned fast enough that the line reached you. Right now, the challenges look different. Climate curves drawn on graphs instead of in tree rings you personally watch each year. Social networks that number in the hundreds of thousands instead of a few dozen familiar faces. Threats that are global, abstract, mediated by code and policy, but the same old brain is still trying to parse them. If you give it half a chance, if you feed it rest and connection, then time outside and honest conversation, it can still do what it's always done: notice patterns, care about others, imagine alternatives. This too is an experiment in being human. Some parts of it will go badly. Some already have. Yet, even that possibility that you and the people around you can look at inherited patterns and say, this piece, we keep this piece, we change, is itself a very ancient move. Culture has always been a remix, not a script carved once and forever. So as you slide closer to sleep, you can let the day's to-dos blur at the edges a little. You can hold, very lightly, the image of a long line of fires stretching back behind you, each one casting a small circle of light into deep night. At every one of those fires, someone is settling down the way you are now, muscles unwinding, mind still buzzing, heart carrying its private cargo of fear and hope. They don't know you, you don't know them, but you are across a staggering gulf of time, during this together, breathing, resting, letting the noise of one brief day fade into the hum of a much older story. If sleep takes you, let it. You will be, for a few hours, exactly what you have always been at the end of a long day, a very old kind of creature, curling up in the dark, trusting that, with any luck, there will be another morning and another chance to try again, to be human in the